Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the Path to Liberty. It's Wednesday, March 18th, 2020, and this is, man, it's kind of an unusual time for all of us. It's an unusual thing for me to be looking at what's going on out there, and with so many emergencies of varying levels being declared around the country, whether it's federal, state, or local, and calls for more government power to respond to just about anything and everything. The question, of course, is can the feds or states or local governments enact a full-on quarantine or a shutdown, a lockdown, whatever it may be? I'm going to go through a number of different things. I'm going to share two prominent constitutionalist views because I'm just going to basically ignore all the garbage out there. I want to focus on two leading constitutionalist views. I'm also going to talk about something known as the incorporation doctrine, just briefly, not a full show on that. And then I also want to share some warnings from James Madison and Richard Henry Lee. First of all, my name is Michael Bolden. We broadcast live every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 9:30 a.m. Pacific time from here in my home office and studio in downtown Los Angeles for the 10th Amendment Center. You can find our live streaming video platforms at YouTube, Facebook, DLive, Twitch, and Periscope or Twitter. We also have archived video versions on BitChute, BitTube, Library, and Brighteon.com, and of course the audio-only podcast editions. That's iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, Google Play, and elsewhere. Find all of our archives, all of the show notes, all the ways to follow us, of course how you can support us for as little as $2 a month. Find all of that over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. Just want to say a quick hello to everyone out in the live chat. I'm so grateful for you joining me. We're going to be around a lot. Depending on how things go, I might start doing extra live streams. I don't know. Let's just see how things go. I've got a good internet connection so far, lots of food and water and everything that I need here at home, so I don't expect to be leaving too often here, especially I'm in the midst of things here, not New York City style, but right in downtown LA, and it's very, very creepy here in Southern California, I can tell you that. But hello to everyone in the live chat. Essential Freedom, good to see you, buddy. Tyler B., Richard Keynes or Coons, I apologize if I get the name pronounced incorrectly. Non-fake news, that's an awesome screen name. Shane Lackey, always good to see you as well. Luke Porras, Tyler B., Chris Reagan, Michael Lure, Kyle Anzalone. I'm going to keep going with that, Kyle. Good to see you, buddy. Melody Skaman, Dan Reed, Slow Feed, good morning. Michael Lure and Andrew Mahoney. Watching our Bill of Rights snared by FEMA, says Randy Perry. Anyways, let's get into this. First of all, the point that I want to start out with, again, and I just mentioned everyone's got an opinion on this, and this is not going to be an episode to talk about the 99.9% of the opinions out there from people who absolutely hate the Constitution. This is not going to be about that at all, because that's a vast majority of them. I want to focus more narrowly on an answer to these questions that come from constitutionalists, without a doubt. And so there's three people that I want to look at primarily. Judge Andrew Napolitano takes one position on this. Brian McClanahan takes another. And then Chris Ann Hall's kind of a mix of maybe the two. I don't know. We'll just kind of go through what they're having to say. And before doing that, I just want to do a quick rundown. This isn't going to be a coronavirus news channel like some others have kind of switched to recently, but I want to go over some of the things that are being implemented. You can see in places like here in California. And let's start out with that. From CNN, San Francisco is living under shelter-in-place orders. I've got a lot of good friends and family up in the Bay Area. I used to spend a lot of time up there. And they're basically on a kind of lockdown. It's not a total lockdown, but they're shutting down a lot of essential businesses. Well, they're shutting down businesses. I think the entire marketplace really is essential for people's life, liberty, and prosperity. But here's how they put it at CNN. Nearly 7 million people living in a wide swath of Northern California, including Silicon Valley, are currently under a shelter-in-place order. So basically, you can go outside, walk around, exercise, run. I believe it explicitly does not allow you to go for bike rides. You're not supposed to be on the streets for any kind of non-essential, if you're not supposed to be going to work, and a lot of offices and businesses are closed. And one of my closest friends, she's a general manager for a chain of restaurants, or a district manager, I believe, and she's still going to work because they've got a takeout counter, and I guess people still got to earn a living, of course. I mean, that's pretty obvious. But that's happening in San Francisco. We also know, and I'm sure you guys are following a lot of this as well, the Miami New Times, basically Governor Ron DeSantis, along with City of Miami Beach Mayor Dan Gelber, essentially shuttered Miami-Dade County's hospitality industry. And then this was yesterday. DeSantis announced further plans to reduce crowds from gathering across the state, including closing all bars and clubs for 30 days. I believe they had actually shut down beaches and things like that, or maybe they can only allow 10 people at a time. I'm not sure exactly, but there's a lot of kind of pseudo or beginning stages of full shutdowns that are already happening. In New Jersey, if you haven't seen this, they activated the National Guard, and they've got a curfew starting from 8 p.m. to 5 a.m. Now, the news that first came out on this, when I first read it, I'm like, oh man, holy crap. They are really ramping stuff up. If they're going to do this in New Jersey, New York, they're going to follow, San Francisco, LA, a lot of places will go to this type of a curfew. It turns out that it's actually a voluntary curfew. And that's what the governor said, Phil Murphy. He said, this is, people are strongly discouraged from being out from 8 p.m. to 5 a.m. But my assumption is they're doing this as a warning. They're basically saying, it really is, to me, when they start going this route, to me, it is a curfew. And it is an enforceable curfew. Whether they should be doing it or not is another question. But the governor is basically saying, look, we're going to see how this plays out. And if people don't stay home, they're going to come in and enforce it. They've already activated the National Guard, and I'm sure that can't have really pretty consequences. Now, how bad could it get? I don't like necessarily saying, I don't like necessarily trying to predict how things are going to play out. But I think looking at Wuhan, China is a pretty good example of the worst of the worst. And here's a reporter from the San Diego Union Tribune, or a guy who used to work for the San Diego Union Tribune, who actually has been working as a journalist nearby in Wuhan. And here's how he put it. I have seen many heart-wrenching videos. Doors to apartment buildings being welded shut in Wuhan to enforce the quarantine. Fires sparked after people disinfect their surroundings or clothing with alcohol, and people suspected of having the virus being dragged out of their homes by crews in protective suits. I don't want to say it can't happen here. My instinct, of course, I'm like, oh man, that's always, when we're talking about the worst of the worst, I start thinking, okay, it's scary. We got to think about that for the future. But who knows? Government is run by authoritarians. Who knows if they'll do that kind of thing here in the U.S.? But I think that's kind of the worst case example of where things can play out. So now that we have kind of that as the foundation, really what we're talking about are two main views from constitutionalists on the answer to the question, can they do this type of a lockdown here in the United States, whether nationally, state, or just on a local or a regional level. And really your view of whether or not you're going to agree really hinges a lot on your view of something known as the incorporation doctrine. This is something that I know I keep saying, oh, I got to cover this at some point. Timothy Martin, who often comments on our YouTube channel, talks about incorporation and pointing out various organizations who support it that he doesn't like. And we've done a lot of work about incorporation here, but there are people who are good. Well, basically, both sides of this, you're going to find people saying, well, that guy's not a constitutionalist, that guy's not a constitutionalist, that girl's not a constitutionalist, and on and on and on, because they're two totally different views of how to look at the Constitution and how things play out between the federal government and the states. The short version, this is a very short version. There are long books, and many of them that really need to be read to really understand the incorporation doctrine. I am not the best of the best on this. Some of the really good people out there are people like Kevin Gutzman, Dave Benner, Mike Meharry's done a lot of writing on this as well. Lawrence Vance, I think over at LouRockwell.com some years ago, used to write about this as well. But anyways, the short version, when the Bill of Rights was ratified in 1791, no one thought the Bill of Rights, this is actually a surprise to a lot of people, no one thought the Bill of Rights actually applied to any level of government other than the federal government. No one thought this. No one thought the Bill of Rights was enforceable by the federal government on the states. There's even a preamble to the Bill of Rights that specifically talks about creating a list of further declaratory and restrictive clauses for the federal government. So they added those things because a lot of people were concerned about the federal government having too much power, and they're like, okay, well, as the Constitution now stands, this was a lot of the opposition from so-called anti-federalists. They said, as it now stands, we're not going to vote in support. But if there's promises or guarantees of further restrictions on the federal government, if we're going to get a Bill of Rights, for example, more amendments, then we'll be on board. And that's what the Bill of Rights was really all about, really hammering home these additional restrictions on the federal government. But then starting in 1925, and this is where I think it gets a little bit weird. So in 1925, the federal courts started reading or taking the position that the 14th Amendment, which was ratified in 1868, I believe, late 1860. So we're talking about 6 decades later, after ratification of the 14th Amendment, the federal court started taking the position that the Bill of Rights were incorporated on the states. And that's the term incorporated. It was incorporated into the federal powers to enforce upon the states. And they've done it through what's called selective incorporation. They take a case here and a case there, and they incorporate part of the Fifth Amendment. So, for example, part of the Fifth Amendment today isn't fully incorporated yet. I'm not sure about the second, but they're basically different bits and pieces that have been added into this incorporation doctrine, which started in the courts in 1925. Now, on the pro-incorporation doctrine side of this question that we're covering today is Judge Andrew Napolitano. We published his article a few days ago, Can the Government Restrict Travel to Protect Public Health? This was published on March 12th. It comes from, it's been published all over the place. You can find it on Lou Rockwell, Creators, Fox News, all over the place. But basically he starts out this way. He's like, all this is background to the issue lurking beneath the headlines this week. Can the government quarantine people without proof of contagion and imminent assault? The short answer is no. He goes on, he says, we know that under the Fifth Amendment, if any government, state or federal, wants to impair the life, liberty, or property of any person, it must follow due process. Now, this is a pro-incorporation doctrine argument because instead of citing similar clauses in state constitutions, he's focusing solely on the Fifth Amendment as applying incorporated in the Bill of Rights to the federal Constitution and applicable to the state. So he's saying the Fifth Amendment is what does it. That's the one that actually restricts all these localities from just going out of town, going crazy, really. The short answer is no. He goes further. Now back to our question of whether the government, state or federal, can confine persons against their will in order to protect public health. He says the short answer is yes. Now, there might be a little nuance there. But going on, he says the Constitution requires procedural due process. That means a trial for every person confined. He goes further. Thus, a government-ordered quarantine of all persons in a city block or a postal zip code or a telephone area code would be an egregious violation of due process, both substantive, and I've got some issues with substantive due process. It didn't really start with the Dred Scott decision in 1857, but basically substantive due process basically got its legs in the 1857 Dred Scott case, where the court held that the slavery prohibition in the Missouri Compromise of 1820 was illegal. But anyways, that's a side note. He says, substantively, no government in America, and I apologize for stumbling over these words, no government in America has the lawful power to curtail natural rights by decree. Sounds good philosophically. And I agree that philosophically, now, I guess the question between philosophical and what's authorized under the Constitution isn't always the same. But going further, he says that means a trial before any quarantine, no matter the public danger. and a fair trial, not one animated by mass hysteria or government-generated fear. And I cannot repeat it enough, that famous quote from John Adams back in 1776, back when he was one of the good guys. He warned us, fear is the foundation of most governments. And those who hear me talk about this, I always want to remove the word most, because fear sets the stage for government to take power, and government rarely takes power just temporarily. They'll always be back with a new baseline to expand on that in the future. So that's the pro-incorporation side. Judge Knapp sums this up really well. The Fifth Amendment applies to every level of government in the country, and this reading of the Fifth Amendment means in order to do any type of a quarantine, they got to do a fair trial before they do any of this, not animated by mass hysteria or government-generated fear. Now, on the other side, and another great constitutionalist is Brian McClanahan. Brian's been absolutely great to the TAC over the years, and he put it this way. We published this morning. Can the government legally set up a quarantine? And he puts it this way. Trump has acknowledged that state governors, and maybe this has changed because these were things that happen in the news are rolling so fast that they're saying one thing and then a few days later it's a little bit different. But this is how it was when Brian sent this out as an email. He says Trump has acknowledged that state governors can probably do a better job than he can to stem the COVID-19 outbreak. Why? Because of the dirty little secret in American politics. I like how he puts that. The states always have more real power than the general government. He goes on. He talks about how Florida Governor Ron DeSantis has basically begged the general government, and I like how he calls it the general government rather than the federal or the central or the national. That's how the founders almost always referred to what we know as the federal government in Washington, D.C. today. They said it was the general government. It's for general purposes, limited delegated powers, and the specific and everything else was reserved to the states, as Madison put it in Federalist 45. But going further, he says this is backwards. DeSantis should just shut it down and then tell the Trump administration to stick it. Now, this is basically the argument that we've put on almost everything. And in fact, years ago, if you followed our work for a number of years, and maybe you've even heard about this, we worked many years ago on a bill to ban invasive TSA screenings at airports in Texas. So there was legislation that actually passed out of, I believe, the Texas House. And then Rick Perry, when he was governor there, was working with the president of the Senate and the state Senate there to hold the bill up. But there was a lot of pressure on this. They actually had to put the bill into a special session. But what ended up happening was that the federal government issued a warning. We saw it as a threat to put basically a no-fly zone over the state of Texas. And our view was basically, okay, if you guys really want to go that hardcore, Texas should just do what it wants to do and tell the federal government to suck it, to stick it, as Brian McClanahan puts it. And that's basically how the states should deal with the federal government on just about everything. Now, whether you think the states should shut down an airport or not is another story. But Brian is taking the federalism approach, saying, like, look, don't beg the federal government to do stuff for you. If you think something needs to be done, do it, whether the federal government wants you to do it or not. And then I don't think he actually focused enough on this, but he does mention it, is that what you can do on a state level is really restricted by the state constitutions. As people are reporting about this, and I'm reading tons of stuff, I'm sure you guys are too, but I'm reading tons of reports about things that are happening. And I have not once seen anyone other than Brian, maybe myself, and a few friends on Facebook or Twitter or something like that. I've not once seen any realistic mainstream report, and I guess I shouldn't use the word realistic, but I've not seen any of them actually refer to a state constitution. No one talks about the state constitution with what's going on in San Francisco. No one's mentioning the state constitution in New Jersey or in Florida or anywhere else. And they're not citing them either. I'm not an expert on all the state constitutions, but we've got Google at least still. We can look at this stuff and find out what's been delegated to the state governments. And so that's basically what Brian McClanahan is saying here. He says, at the same time, state governments are the ones who have the power to shut down bars, restaurants, or public meeting places. The general government cannot. So that's Brian McClanahan's federalism view. And he goes on, he says, as James Wilson. Now, James Wilson, a lot of people call James Madison the father of the Constitution. I think more rightfully, this is James Wilson, but that's a conversation for another episode. But as James Wilson said, and he was a nationalist as far as he loved centralizing power. He, Alexander Hamilton, and a few others were really the ones that were advocating for the most centralized power. We generally think of Hamilton as being the lead in that, but James Wilson probably was right up there, if not worse than Hamilton. Although Hamilton was kind of just a lying dog. I think Wilson, even though he liked centralized power, wanted more power in the general government. I think Wilson wasn't necessarily a lying piece of garbage like Hamilton was. Anyways, Wilson said in the State House Yard speech in October 1787, and Brian says he's paraphrasing here, the state governments have all the powers not prohibited by the state constitutions. So state governments can do things that are not prohibited to them in their own state constitution, while the general government has only the powers granted by the United States Constitution. So if the federal government says they want to do something, I know just maybe 10, 15 minutes ago, the president announced this kind of Defense Production Act. He's invoking the Defense Production Act. I've actually never read this, but from my understanding, this is the one that was used by the Truman administration during the war with China and Korea back in the 1950s. He goes on. This is Brian. The states could control this outbreak by any means necessary. This is not to say that some of these methods would not be draconian. Expect the worst. But we have to acknowledge the vast powers of the state governments in such a crisis. Each state is a state, meaning a sovereign political entity. And perhaps this crisis will quicken our interest in federalism and decentralization. I like how he sums it up. Basically, Alabama should watch out for Alabama, California should watch out for California, and not vice versa. I mean, obviously, we're all humans, and we want each one of us to be well and healthy and safe and prosperous. But I can't here in Los Angeles protect someone in Maine. And politicians who try to tell you to do the same thing are really, to me, I think they're either misguided or just power-hungry monsters. So state constitutions are something that we have not been paying attention to. We haven't been reading, and it's something that we should really be looking at. If we're going to be constitutionalists, there's more than one constitution in this country. It's not just the Constitution for the United States of America. And I've actually not done a good job on this myself, so maybe this will be a good reminder, like Brian says. And he did an entire podcast episode on this, I think 2 days ago. You can find it on YouTube under that title, Can the Government Legally Set Up a Quarantine? So the short version on this is pro-incorporation. If you're on the side of incorporation, that means you look to the Constitution for the United States for restrictions on what governments at every single level can do, and then they apply the exact same way everywhere. There is no variance. It is a centralized solution, one-size-fits-all approach. And then the pro-federalism approach means that you look to each state constitution. Now, the problems can be things like this. On the incorporation side, when they make a mistake for everybody. Now, when they get it right for everybody. But when they screw up, and I don't trust government, they screw up for everyone. On the federalism side, when they screw up or go too far, do something wrong, at least their screw up, and this is the whole point of federalism, the 10th Amendment and the Constitution, when they screw up, it's at least limited to a geographic area of their power that they can implement. Now, where all these people agree, whether it's pro-incorporation or pro-federalism, Napolitano, McClanahan, I also want to bring my friend Chris Ann Hall into this, is on the ability of the federal government to have emergency powers. Here's how Chris Ann Hall put it in an article that I think she published earlier this year. Maybe it was sometime last year, but I think it's very applicable as well. She says, I got to pull this up on the screen. Sorry about that. Chris Ann says, does the Constitution enumerate a power to the president to declare a state of emergency? The short answer is no. I mean, we can all read the Constitution. Does it actually say these powers are delegated to Congress, well, unless there's an emergency, and then the executive branch can do this. It doesn't say the right to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed unless there's an emergency. It does not say Congress shall have the power to declare war unless there's an emergency. I mean, well, it just keeps going on and on and on. And she points out that every state of emergency refers to the National Emergencies Acts as the source of its authority. So the real question is, and she highlights this in bold, does the Constitution authorize Congress to alter, whether expand or contract, executive power by legislative act? The constitutional answer to this question is obviously no. So the powers that have been delegated to the government in the Constitution are the ones that are delegated to it. They can't just change it willy-nilly every time they want to change it for something. She goes on, Congress cannot add powers that the Constitution has not delegated to the president, nor can they take away powers that have been delegated. So where the president is authorized to act, they can't say, well, now you're restricted, and on. So that's Chris Ann Hall on this. Judge Napolitano is a very similar, if not a shorter version of that same position where it comes to emergency powers. He says, now back to what the feds can do and what the states can do in a public health crisis. Quote, there are no emergency provisions or triggers in the Constitution. Period. Zero. You can read it. Just Google it. Yet Congress gave itself, or start page it if you want to get a little bit more privacy, yet Congress gave itself the power to regulate public health and safety under various pretexts. The pretexts exist because the nanny state urge of members of Congress to regulate is confronted by the reservation in the 10th Amendment of health and safety to the states. They're very clear, the founders were very clear that the police powers is the kind of the general legal term. The police powers to deal with health and safety are state by state, not with the federal government. And here's Brian McClanahan. He doesn't even need a full sentence on it. He says, and now that Trump has issued a state of emergency declaration, unconstitutional, so that billions of unconstitutional dollars can flood the private sector, the legal question seems moot. But is it? And that's kind of how he summed it up at the early part. But basically, he's just saying, look, this is unconstitutional. It's not even worth a discussion. There are no emergency powers in the Constitution. And before summing this all up and wrapping it up, I want to just kind of hammer home some warnings from some leading founders. For example, James Madison, the one we all call the father of the Constitution. He said this, there are more instances of the abridgment of the freedom of the people by gradual and silent encroachments of those in power than by violent and sudden usurpation. Now, sometimes you get that latter, but a lot of times what ends up being the latter, the violent and sudden usurpation, were set up for decades and decades and decades. A lot of the things that the governments tend to cite have been on the books for a long time when they want to exercise so-called emergency powers. And this is how we put it in our tweet, like the fable of the boiling frog, Madison's warning is coming true right now. More and more government power for this emergency or the next is boiling us all alive. Another one from James Madison, and this is just a general warning from a speech in a Virginia Constitutional Convention, Virginia Convention in December of 1829. He said, the essence of government is power, and power lodged as it must be in human hands will ever be liable to abuse. So I'm not telling you what to believe. I'm not telling you what to support or telling you what is going to be right for you. That's not for my call to make. I tell you, I'm on the pro-federalism side on this. But I don't think just the states can just willy-nilly do whatever they want. We got to really start spending time looking at state constitutions. Many of them are very restrictive as well. The Virginia State Constitution, but of course, remember, in Federalist 48, Madison was very clear that even the best constitution is a mere parchment barrier. Waving the Constitution at people, at government people, doesn't make them stop. Words on paper will never enforce themselves, but they're important for us to keep in mind so we understand what the line in the sand is for all of us. And then one other one, we posted this morning. This is from Richard Henry Lee in a letter to Samuel Adams. They were really interesting friends, even though they came from totally different backgrounds, different lifestyles, different states, Massachusetts and Virginia. This is a letter to Samuel Adams on the 5th of October, 1787. And this is a paraphrase, really. It says, the people didn't fight the British to be brought under despotic rule under the notion of strong government or in the form of elective despotism. And just closing it out, if you guys are interested, I'm just going to just briefly read these titles to you. We've got two articles and one free ebook on the incorporation doctrine from a founders and federalist perspective. Mike Meharry, an article from 2014, wrote, "Was the Bill of Rights meant to apply to the states?" Then we've got this one from Raoul Berger, who passed away, who wrote an incredible bunch of books, but one that this is just excerpted from the book Government by Judiciary. This is like a must read on this issue. Even some people that I've talked to, some legal scholars, constitutional scholars, one guy who's been cited by the Supreme Court a bunch of times, who I think is generally pro-incorporation, he's like, man, Berger, his research methods are actually far better than what his side today is actually using. So Berger was really an incredible writer and researcher. Government by Judiciary, but we've got an excerpt of that we published a few years ago, Incorporation of the Bill of Rights in the 14th Amendment, and then Dave Benner's great free ebook, The 14th Amendment in the Incorporation Doctrine. I will include links to those in the show notes at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. I'm going to do just a brief look in the live chat here. Not real long, because I got to do a little bit of prep work. I'm doing an interview with Pete Raymond and Tom Woods in about, it looks like an hour and a half. That's going to be published this week as well. Archangel for Truth says, how do we interpret the part of the 10th that says, or to the people? Well, I think that's just pretty straightforward. It's or to the people. And mind you, the people of the several states are sovereign. If we're talking about sovereignty, sovereignty to the founders is final authority. And under the American system, sovereignty is not really in any government. There is no real state sovereignty. It is just kind of a catchphrase. There is no sovereignty in the federal government. It is the people of the several states. So the people of the states, they delegate powers to each level of government, and they can take those powers back anytime they want. DK over on YouTube says, I'm prepped fully. That's pretty awesome. I think I'm pretty good here, as good as I can be in Southern California as far as food, water, and all the goods that I need. Valerie Barnett, oh, it looks like that's a separate conversation. DK says, Alaska is hopping too this morning. Jason Barker reminds us the Ben Franklin quote, those who would give up essential liberty to purchase a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety. There's various versions of that. Good to see JJ Boogie over on Periscope. DK says, West Coast is expecting a large quake. I saw there was one in Utah today. Geneva Anderson, I've got a lot of guns, so I ain't worrying. I know I'm even seeing people. There was a report in the LA Times this week showing how, primarily in Glendale, which is a suburb maybe about 6 miles north of downtown here, where there's a bunch of gun shops. There's like lines of people. And mind you, the horrible state regulations that make it such a slow process here. Whereas I know Essential Freedom was pointing out the other day, I think it may have been on Twitter, you can pop in and out and get an AR in Missouri in no time. But here, I mean, first of all, that's not even an option. But just for a basic handgun, it's not necessarily a fast process. We'll put it that way. But people are waiting in line, and they're interviewing people. The LA Times was interviewing people, and they're basically saying, people were agreeing to be interviewed and basically saying, look, you can't have my name in this. They're so uncomfortable. They don't want their coworkers to find out. Somebody was like an animator at some studio. I don't want my coworkers, my friends, my family to know I'm doing this, because the culture of self-defense here in Southern California has been totally decimated. It doesn't really exist. I know this firsthand. I have a problem with it myself because I've just been indoctrinated for my whole life that this kind of thing is bad. Madanoff is talking about the state constitution. I'm not sure what state you're referring to. Anna Reyes, good to see you. Sorry I'm late. Good morning. Bob Brewer says, let's quarantine our geographically smallest representative body. That's an awesome one. I'm all for building a wall. I just want it around Washington, D.C. And then we'll figure out amongst the rest of the states how to deal with stuff. That's awesome. R.W. Glass says George Mason was the architect of the Constitution, the Bill of Rights. Mason was not the architect of the Constitution. It was primarily Madison and Wilson. Many people were involved, but Mason was very, very influential. And he actually kind of lamented, because he did not actually sign it, how his great friend, he was friends for many years with George Washington, and he was basically on the outs with Washington over the years after that as well. Geneva Anderson says, after elections are over, then the virus will go away, because that's what happened to the Ebola last year. I wonder. Going further, charity is voluntary, says Bill Stannard. Absolutely. Charity is voluntary. And if it isn't voluntary, it's theft. Whether it's asset forfeiture being theft, or taxation being theft, or forcing foreign aid. I mean, the trillions of dollars that they've probably spent over the years handing money to foreign dictators is just a total tragedy. Anyways, my urge to you today, my request, is that you focus when you're looking at these constitutional issues of the states, whether you agree with incorporation or not. Let's all spend a little bit more time understanding the state constitutions, because they're incredibly important as well. And I think they should be used as a battering ram to at least point out where government the government isn't going to follow the Constitution. We can't expect that. But the more that we point it out, the more difficult it'll be for them to violate our right to life, liberty, property, and on and on. Well, I hope you guys found this interesting. It's a very crazy time we're living in right now, isn't it? I hope you enjoyed the show. I hope you learned something. I'm learning as I go on this. If you support us, we can certainly use your help. 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. I see a bunch of people who are members. I'm very grateful for the financial support. It's as little as $2 a month for our monthly membership program. We also have yearly, lifetime, 5 years, etc. And if you can't spend any money right now, that's cool too. All the stuff that you do for free, like smashing the like button, leaving comments, sharing links, subscribing, reviews on iTunes, all of those things trigger the algorithms of the platforms you may be watching or listening on, and it tells that algorithm to show the program to more people. So all that free stuff, smash that like. It really, really helps a lot. Well, I hope you guys found this interesting. I hope you stay safe and healthy out there, and I'll see you next time here on the Path to Liberty.